Everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Caitlin and I upload 3 times a week on this channel. Wednesdays are fashion and lifestyle videos, Fridays are my weekly weeks in my life at university where I just vlog a week at university, and then Sundays are my Unsolved Sundays where I discuss some sort of solved or unsolved true crime case. So today I'm back with another one of my Unsolved Sunday videos, and we're going to be discussing the unsolved case of Damien Nettles. Now this was one of the suggestions that one of you guys actually left me, so thank you so much for your suggestions. As always, leave any cases or any videos in general you want me to do in the comments, or send me a message on any of my social media that are on the screen. I have a massive list, especially of mystery video cases to discuss, so I will always add all of your suggestions to a list. So if you want to hear a little bit about Damien's case and kind of what happened to him and the investigation behind it, then keep on watching and we shall just get started. So like I said, today's case we're going to be discussing is the disappearance of a boy named Damien Nettles. Now Damien was a 16-year-old boy at the time of his disappearance, and he lived on the Isle of Wight. Damien was described as being a gentle giant and a larger-than-life young boy who was known to be extremely loving and caring towards those around him. On the 2nd of November 1996, Damien had arranged to go to a house party in a place I think is pronounced Xoxo, but I could be wrong. I'm so sorry if I pronounce anything wrong, like I always say. So I think it was in a place called Xoxo, and so basically he was just meeting a couple of his friends to go to this house party not far from where he lived. Before he left for the party that night, he called up his girlfriend, whose name was Gemma Nunn, and they'd been in a relationship since August of that year. Gemma was in Suffolk, which is about a 4.5-hour drive-ish from where Damien lived on the Isle of Wight. So he called her just to kind of say that he was missing her, and And Gemma said that they'd had just a really lovely phone call, just kind of a typical long distance phone call, basically he wanted to tell her he missed her. At around 7 PM that evening, Damien headed out for the party. He left after agreeing with his mum that he could extend his usual curfew and stay out that night until midnight. So that night, Damien was last seen leaving the house in blue jeans and a black fleece, and he left the house with no personal belongings, no items that he took with him. Damien's father, his name was Edward Nettles, and he had agreed to drop Damien off at his friend's house before the boys then going to the party. So at around 7:30 PM that night, Edward Nettles dropped off Damien at his friend Chris Boone's house, and then not long after this point, when he'd gotten dropped off, Damien, Chris, and then Chris's brother Davey all left for the party in East Coast. The party was described as being fairly small, with the guests mainly being 3 couples and then Damien by himself. The other guests had recalled that night Damien wanting to kind of leave early. He wasn't seeming particularly interested, but Chris, his friend, just kind of assumed it was because he was bored or was feeling left out, because like I said, the party did consist of couples. Chris's brother Davey, however, actually believed that Damien wanted to leave because he wanted to go pick up cannabis from his usual dealer. According to Davey, Chris's dealer had been giving him sort of issues since the summer. He'd kind of not been fulfilling the orders that Damien had been placing and just kind of things like that. At around 9:30 PM, Damien wanted to leave the party and Chris agreed to go with him. So they hopped on a ferry in the direction of West Coast, which is back in the direction of their homes. And on their way home, the pair stopped in a small shop just to buy some cider. Chris said that as they'd left the party, Damien had taken a black camera, and when they left that night, he'd been carrying that camera around with him. So there were CCTV cameras all along the route they'd taken home that night, which meant that there was extensive footage that kind of led to just a great understanding of the timelines of that night, of kind of where the boys had started, where they'd gone on their journey, and what happened up until Damien's disappearance. From around 9:30 that evening, CCTV footage seemed to show kind of for the next few hours Damien just jumping from one pub to the next on the high street, just seemingly going in and then coming out again not long after, as though he was looking for someone. So because of the fact, mainly because of his appearance, he was 6'4" tall, and he kind of just looked older, so a lot of people just believe that he had such ease getting into these pubs because he looked older than he was. But Chris was much smaller than him and therefore looked a lot younger, and on the CCTV footage, when you can see Damien going in and out of all these pubs, it's often Chris who is left outside waiting for him to come back out again. Chris claimed that on that night, Damien had told him that he wanted to enter all these pubs because he was going in search of his older sister Sarah, and this was also later confirmed by a witness at one of the pubs, one of the locations, who had overheard Damien saying this to Chris as well. So to his knowledge, they were just looking for his sister Sarah because Damien knew she'd be in one of the pubs along the high street. However, when this piece of information was shared, Valerie Nettles, who is Damien's mum, said that this was extremely strange behaviour on Damien's behalf, because he knew that his older sister Sarah would actually be in Portsmouth that night and not on the Isle of Wight. So it was kind of a bit of confusion there as to why he claimed he was looking for Sarah. So this led to many people kind of speculating as to why he used Sarah, most likely as a reason to kind of hide the real reason he wanted to enter all these pubs, and some people even believe that he may have been looking for his usual drug dealer. CCTV footage also showed that at around 10 PM Damien entered a chip shop called Yorkies. When he was inside, he picked up a salt shaker, kind of looked at it a bit, put it down, and then left the shop again. This was extremely strange behaviour, and once again no one knows sort of why he did this. At around 10:30 PM Chris said he felt extremely cold and wet because of the winter weather, and he kind of begged Damien to just go home. They said it was time to go home, and Damien eventually agreed, and they decided to continue their journey home. They headed out towards Chris's home. The pair then split at Northwood Park. Chris claimed that he was 100% sure that at this point when they split, Damien continued walking through the park towards the direction of his home. He said he was completely sure this was the case because he wanted to make sure that Damien was heading in the direction of his home. However, it's believed that instead of completing his journey home, which was only a 20-minute walk back to his home, it's believed that Damien actually just turned around and headed straight back towards the high street. And it was at this point that Damien was seen for the second time on CCTV footage entering the same chip shop. Witnesses on the high street that night claimed that he appeared extremely intoxicated, some even saying that he appeared spaced out. At 11:15 PM, a witness outside the Harbour Lights pub on the high street said that he recalls seeing Damien trying the door handles of a blue Ford Fiesta in the car park. Now the witness said that this behaviour seemed extremely erratic and strange, but it was almost kind of as though there wasn't enough concern because he hadn't managed to break into the car, but also he wasn't entirely sure that it wasn't his car. So I think a lot of people in that sort of scenario would assume that he just locked himself out of his car, but he wasn't successful in getting into the car. So no one really knows, again, the explanation behind this behaviour. From here, he was spotted at a bus stop near the Co-op by the High Street. He had gotten on a bus and attempted to talk to the bus driver, which is then when he tried to take the bus driver's photo, thanked him, and just got off the bus again. So once again, no explanation for this really strange behaviour. Then at 11:59 PM, he was spotted by another witness in exactly the same spot at the bus stop. The man was in his car, he was waiting to pick up his child, and he recalled seeing Damien sitting at the bus stop, and he described him as being a miserable figure huddled eating chips. The witness said he had matched Damien's description, and he was also carrying a camera matching the description of the one that Chris had described as him taking from the party. He said that once Damien had spotted him in his car, Damien headed towards the car, which is where he kind of fell into it. The car wasn't moving, so he kind of just fell into the car. The man said he appeared kind of drugged, and then after this he simply walked away from the car in the direction of the Pierview public house on the high street. It was here that he was last seen on CCTV footage, but then after the camera picked him up at this point, he completely seemed to vanish from sight. It was after this point that Damien couldn't be seen on any other CCTV footage in the area, and no witness came forward as to suggesting where he'd gone. No one had seen him past this point. So upon investigating his disappearance, authorities determined that there were two routes that Damien could have taken from this point in order to get home. The first route was through the park that Chris had originally parted ways with him at, and the second way was through kind of a coastal, it's by the seafront, it's a coastal walk. The seafront was a particularly dangerous route, especially in the dark and kind of in the winter weather. It just wasn't safe. So many people argue that even in his drunken state, this would not have seemed to him as appealing, that he wouldn't have wanted to go down this route because everyone knows how dangerous it is in the dark. So many people believe that there is no chance he would have taken that, even if he'd been in a dazed state, and he would have likely gone through the park route. So this means that the only route he could have taken from the high street that wouldn't end up in any of the CCTV footage was a road called Sun Hill. So even on a Saturday, this road is extremely quiet, and the locals say that you can hear conversations from inside the houses, everything that goes on outside along that road. So people argue that if anything had happened to him, if he'd encountered trouble or he'd hurt himself or anything, people would have heard it. The following morning, when Damien's family realised he hadn't slept in his bed, they called Chris's house and became worried when no one had heard from him, because obviously Chris had last seen him heading in the direction of his home and had assumed that he'd gotten home that night. They began searching all the local areas. They approached all of his friends, any potential places that he could be, and then at 3 PM on the Sunday they reported him as officially missing. So according to Damien's family, the police did very little in those early days of the investigation, and they just didn't seem to aid it in any way. and they claim that they ended up doing a lot of the kind of searching themselves. A friend of Valerie Nettles, Damien's mum, her name was Dr. Corinne Lawrence. She was actually the one who managed to get her hands on the CCTV footage that provided this kind of extensive timeline of what happened to Damien that night. So obviously this is something that the police should have been able to get their hands on. It should have been them that came across this footage to aid the investigation, but Lawrence herself actually sought out this CCTV footage from each of the shops along the high street. So she had been a counsellor around the time of Damien's disappearance in the town, so she kind of knew a lot of the owners and things, so she knew that if the police weren't going to do it, then she was going to go herself and try and find this footage. So the chip shop that I had mentioned kind of earlier on, just about where Damien had been seen along that night, there was footage of him on CCTV camera, and the workers recalled him seeming particularly out of it when he came into the shop. They said that they remembered him really struggling to understand what they were saying to him, and it took him ages to decide what he wanted, and then when he eventually decided that he wanted a bag of chips, they gave it to him, he paid, and he left. But also on the footage, it appeared to show that sort of in the time that he was waiting for his food, there was a group of 5 men also in the chip shop who spoke to Damien. This was later ruled out to be anything suspicious because it kind of just seemed like a friendly conversation. There was no issue that arose from it, there was no fight, argument, anything like that. It was ruled out as being a friendly, harmless conversation. However, the police's inquiry into these 5 men didn't actually take place or finish until 5 years after Damien's disappearance. So it wasn't until 5 years after the disappearance that the Nettles family learned that these 5 men were actually in the military. So the issue with this is that in taking this long to follow up these leads, because obviously now we know that there wasn't anything crucial there, but they could have seen something or met someone really vital that night, but 5 years down the line they aren't going to remember little details that could be potentially like groundbreaking in this investigation. So there is a lot of bad things to say about the way the police carried out this investigation. Dr. Lawrence claimed that many people at the time believed that the police were particularly biased in this investigation from the start, and that they kind of decided on what they thought his fate was before they even properly looked into his case. So they'd kind of pushed from the start, the authorities, the likelihood of Damien falling into the sea along that coastal route that I mentioned earlier, and just kind of drowning as a result and being taken out to sea. But there are so many people who at the time and still to this day do not believe this. Members of the local authority even went as far as to publicly shame Damien's mum and Dr. Lawrence, which is insane. So like openly in the front of the public, they called them hysterical women for pushing this case, for arguing that they don't think that the investigation was being carried out correctly, which is absolutely awful. Like, no team of authority members should ever do that. At one point when the police themselves had gone into looking into the CCTV footage that Dr. Lawrence had already had her hands on, they actually spent months looking for this footage, but eventually realised that they were looking into the wrong person. They were kind of collecting or trying to reach the wrong person who didn't actually have access to the CCTV footage, which is when Valerie and Dr. Lawrence pointed them in the right direction and said that they'd gotten their hands on the footage. So like I said, it seemed to be particularly prominent that authorities were pushing this kind of scenario where he'd fallen into the sea and been taken out to sea. But like I said, so many people didn't believe this because he knew the area. It was just very unlikely, even in a dazed state, that he would do so. And kind of obviously his family were very, very against this scenario. So much so that his father took it upon himself to go and see the harbour master captain and kind of ask his opinion. The harbour master captain kind of looked at all of the information that he had on that night, so like tidal sets and rate and things like that, and he determined that there was no way that Damien would have fallen into the sea and then not been brought back to shore, basically. So he said that if he'd fallen into the sea and drowned, unfortunately, he would have been brought back to shore within 2 or 3 days. It might have taken a couple days longer because obviously the water's colder because it's winter time, but they would have found his body way before this point in the investigation. So at this point it just seemed less and less likely that he fell into the sea because there are so many factors suggesting that he didn't. Damien had been a happy boy, and his family are adamant that there would be no reason for him to want to intentionally run away, especially the circumstances surrounding that night in terms of sort of the weird places he was looking and things, and no one knows what he was looking for. His ex-girlfriend, her name was Abby Scott. They had been together I think for around 18 months just before he got with his current girlfriend, and she said that he was just a lovely person. She had no bad words to say about him, but she does recall that in the last few months sort of In the summer of that year, towards the end of their relationship, he started hanging out with different group of people who were older than him. They were into possibly drugs. She thinks they were into drugs maybe. He was more secretive, but it wasn't sort of a bad character. He didn't become a bad character. He just was hanging around with a different group of people. And again, because of this and a number of other factors, many people kind of pushed more and more the speculation, the possibility of there being drug involvement further, like past casual kind of cannabis use. In March 2002, the investigation was actually handed over to the Hampshire Constabulary's Major Crime Department. Sorry, that's really hard to say. And it was at this point that an anonymous informant came forward and said that he was adamant that a local drug dealer, his name was Nicky McNamara, was involved in Damien's disappearance. This informant's information was not acted upon by law enforcement at all, and then 8 years later, the informant, when he realised that his information hadn't entered sort of any part of the investigation, he decided to take upon himself to contact Valerie Nettles and tell her his information that he had provided the police with and they chose not to do anything with. He claimed that on that night, Damien and McNamara had met up and they were arguing over McNamara not supplying him with cannabis, and McNamara had ultimately thrown a punch, and not intending to kill him, but because of the state that Damien was in, it injured him a lot more than he'd intended to, and unfortunately Damien had died as a result. He also then claims that Damien's body was kept in a known sort of local drug den for about 3 weeks, where it was then moved to be buried near a cycle path not too far from the den, sort of in the local area of Cove. So that is the informant's information, which is very, very interesting actually, to hear what he was adamant had happened that night. Following the second release of this information in 2010, a number of men were arrested, sort of to do with the local drug scene, and the main thing linking all of these arrests together was Nicky McNamara. The areas where the informant claimed that Damien's body had been buried was searched and nothing was found, and so the authorities began to sort of claim that the informant that had come forward was unreliable, because each of the places he had said that Damien's body could have possibly been buried were false. He'd given them false information, so they began to say that he was unreliable. In 1999, there were rumours circulating that Damien had actually been attacked by a known sort of local paedophile who had ultimately killed him, but when this was searched, authorities determined that the man, the paedophile, had not even been on the island at the time of Damien's disappearance, so this was ruled out. In 2002, another local paedophile actually came forward and claimed that he'd been involved in Damien's murder, but these claims were proven to be false. They just looked into them and said that he'd been lying, so again, this was another sort of false confession. At one point, one of Damien's friends from before his disappearance, who'd become sort of in later years involved in the local drug scene, he came forward and said that he had heard of Damien being actually attacked as a result of a sexual motive. When he died as a result, they actually buried him near a place called Northwood House. This, however, was later recanted, and the boy who knew Damien began denying him ever sharing this information. So over the years, many theories have come forward. So many people have speculated. There have been loads of rumours about what could have happened to Damien that night. So many locals sort of discuss it. It's just, there are so many different theories, and it just seems to be that the most prominent ones keep leading back to that local drug dealer, Nicky McNamara. So authorities sort of in the area said that they investigated these claims into Nicky McNamara and his potential involvement in the year 2002, and they searched him for a few years. They kind of investigated it, but ultimately found no leads. So obviously, as usual with these sort of things, people began speculating whether the police had actually done their job or not, whether they'd looked into it that well, or whether there was some sort of cover-up. But yeah, that was kind of where it ended, and it's baffling that after all this time they still haven't found any information as to what happened that night, because he can't have just vanished. So that is everything I have on Damien Nettles' disappearance today. There is a documentary on, I think it's the BBC 3 channel actually on YouTube that you can watch. It's a 2-part documentary into Damien's disappearance that I'm halfway through, so that's really interesting if you want to check that out. There's kind of not loads of information because, like I said, he just kind of seemed to have vanished, but if you want to look into it, I'll try and leave some interesting links to read down below. So yeah, let me know what you guys think. I honestly don't know what to think about this one. This is baffling to me. It does seem to be that links with this local drug dealer seem to be the most likely, but I don't know. Again, there still isn't that much evidence, so it's very strange. Heartbreaking again for the family that they don't have any answers after all this time. So yes, leave me any other cases you want me to discuss in future weeks' videos down below, just along with any other sort of general requests you want me to do for videos. I hope you guys found this interesting, and I will see you guys soon for another video. Bye.